As we reach the end of 2024 and head into 2025, I thought it would be a good time to take a large scale look at the Russo-Ukraine war. That is, what's happened in the last year or so, what's happening currently, and what's likely to happen if current trends continue in 2025. That being said, let's get into it. So, very early on during this conflict, I coined the term Schrodinger's War. Now, for those of you who aren't aware, Schrodinger's War is a reference to Schrodinger's cat, which I won't go into all the details, but basically it's an experiment involving quantum mechanics based in the idea that two contradictory things can be true at the same time. That is, you can be both a zero and a one at the same time. The cat can be alive or dead at the same time. And it doesn't matter if these two things are mutually exclusive, they somehow are both true. And a lot of what happens in this war is very Schrodinger-esque, in which things seem to be happening in direct contradiction to each other at the same time. This is particularly true when we look at rhetoric, especially in the Western media. For instance, we are told that Russia is a corrupt, incompetent third world country that is a gas station masquerading as a nation, and yet somehow Russia has to be stopped in Ukraine, or they're going to overrun all of Europe. That Ukraine has lost, I think the most recent thing Zelensky said was like 48,000 soldiers, and yet Ukraine is somehow facing a massive manpower shortage. That Putin is not willing to negotiate, even though he's repeatedly said he's been willing to negotiate since before the crisis begins. And this is also true on the battlefield, where we get wildly contradicting reports. I think Media Zona, who has been tracking Russian casualties, says something like there's been 80 to 90,000 Russian deaths, which personally sounds about right to me. The Ukrainian army, I think, claims something like 600 to 800,000 Russians have died. And so we have two casualty numbers that are not only different, as one would expect, but are orders of magnitude different, that exist in completely different universes. And often just the factors that are going on in this war kind of defy description, defy comprehension. They don't make sense. People don't act in what you would consider rational, logical ways. And I think that's very much where we're at going into 2025. Now, with regards to 2025, what I mean is the war is simultaneously almost over and nowhere near being over. I think in military terms, we are kind of reaching the end game in one way or another. And we'll go into that first, and then I'll talk about what I mean by it not being anywhere close to over. Ukraine has suffered immense casualties. I'm not going to attempt to guess at the actual numbers. It's extremely difficult. You get guesstimates all over the place, ranging from tens of thousands in the case of Zelensky to hundreds of thousands or even over 1 million. The point is, the Ukrainian army, by all accounts, and this includes Ukrainian soldiers, the Ukrainian Rada, and Western officials, is Ukraine is facing a massive manpower shortage. Now, we're told that they've taken virtually no casualties, but Schrodinger's war, so they're facing a manpower shortage despite not taking any casualties. And to try to deal with this, they keep lowering the conscription age, they keep raising the conscription age. They've started just drafting people with disabilities or other issues. If you've seen any of the videos, they're just kidnapping people off the street. There's just press gangs roaming around, waiting outside of gyms, waiting outside of nightclubs to drag people off into the army. Regardless of what the actual numbers are, this is not the sign of a healthy military. This is not the sign of a military that's well trained, that's well organized. And I've talked about it numerous times here. But Western trainers and even Ukrainian soldiers that I've seen being interviewed in Western sources will say they're sometimes given as little as 3 days training. If they're lucky, a couple weeks, maybe a month or so, and then they're thrown into battle, under-equipped, under-trained, many of them not in any sort of physical condition to serve in a war, and they just kind of get chewed up. On the other hand, the Russian army has a massive manpower advantage that's growing by the day. If you haven't seen it, History Legends did a video about the amount of money they're offering to join the Russian army. It's life-changing money. He was just adding all these different bonuses together, and it comes out to be many times what a yearly salary would be, at least what the minimum wage is. So Russia has not had trouble recruiting since the initial mobilization effort in the first year of the war. They've recruited something like, I think it's around 30 to 40,000 men a month. And these men are given full training, as far as I can determine. So that's 6 months to a year. It's part of the reason why the Russian army's been moving so slow, because the people who they were recruiting, they tend to put through full training regiments. So you have one country who's able to recruit military-aged males in proper shape, presumably to serve in the military, and give them 6 months to a year of training and fully outfit them, versus another side that's having to kidnap people off of the street and basically just throw them into the battle as cannon fodder. Now, does that really seem like a sustainable situation? It isn't. And once again, the issue isn't even necessarily the numbers that Ukraine has. It's the fact that they don't have trained men. They don't have trained, experienced men who are highly motivated to fight. And that is a ticking time bomb. Eventually, something is going to give, just talking about this from a manpower situation. I've seen lots of reports in Western media that desertion is a big problem. Morale is extremely low. If you see interviews with Ukrainian soldiers, they're just depressed, hopeless. Some will say the average lifespan of a new arrival is something like 3 hours. It's just, it's really depressing. It's really bad. And you really have to wonder how long that is going to hold out. As I've said many times, I am kind of very surprised that the Ukrainian army has not collapsed at this point in time, that there hasn't been some sort of widespread mutiny, at least among the troops who are being forced to launch futile attacks. But they haven't so far. Like, the situation keeps getting worse. So it's once again, it's Schrodinger's war. The army's continually on the brink of collapse, but it's not on the brink of collapse at all. Like, in my mind, it should have happened a long time ago. And I'll say once again, all the credit in the world to the bravery of the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian soldiers. They have made sacrifices in situations that they should not be in, fighting for people who don't deserve their loyalty and their bravery. So in terms of manpower, Ukraine is gradually just losing whatever manpower it has left. The Russian army also has a massive advantage in terms of equipment. Ukraine does not have an air force anymore. I think they might have a couple planes that they can use for interdiction or to launch certain missiles that can only be launched. But Ukraine functionally does not have an air force. Russia has been hunting Ukrainian air defense, and Ukraine functionally does not have an air defense system anymore. They have like a couple here and there. It's not as if they have no air defense, but they don't have a widespread system anymore. And in a lot of cases, the Russians don't only have air superiority, they have air supremacy. So the Russian Air Force can basically do whatever it wants. A lot of the Russian drones can basically do whatever they want. And they can just shoot at it, I guess, with flak guns or machine guns or whatever. But they just don't have the number of missiles necessary or the number of launchers necessary to really do much about it. Earlier in the war, we talked a lot more about shell production, wherein Russia was firing something like 6 or 7 times as many artillery shells a day as Ukraine is. And additionally, Russia was able to produce more artillery and repair its artillery, whereas Ukraine has not been getting much more from the West, and their stocks are gradually going down. Also, Russia has slowly but surely been targeting their artillery, knowing that it cannot be replaced. I haven't seen shell figures in quite some time. I would imagine, though, it's still about 5 or 6 to 1. I think it very much depends on the location. Ukraine is able to gain firepower superiority on a local basis because of how long the front line is. But across the entirety of the front line, they're at a massive disadvantage. The Russians also have a massive missile advantage. They're launching so many large-scale missile attacks of tens, hundreds, thousands of missiles all across Ukraine that they don't even really report on it anymore, destroying the infrastructure, ammo dumps, all that kind of stuff. And Russia has deployed its new, I don't know if you want to call it a super weapon, but secret weapon, the Arezhnev, Rick, which I forget if it's Mach 17 or 18 it goes, but it's extremely fast. The fastest, I think, missile ever developed, unless I'm mistaken. And it cannot be intercepted, and it has multiple, I think it's MIVR, multiple entry vehicle or whatever. It has 36 warheads, and the one they used, I believe, only used titanium rod. So it was just a kinetic kinetic force weapon, but they can also put explosives on them, and they're extremely powerful. They've only used one so far, but the ability to basically fire a missile that lands in a big, powerful missile that lands anywhere in a couple of minutes and can't be intercepted is extremely important, especially considering that it is a non-nuclear weapon, so it can be used basically as much as Russia wants to, depending on their stockpile and depending on whether or not the target is worth hitting it. Russia's also been deploying glide bombs in increasingly large numbers. These, for those of you who aren't aware, are basically iron bombs or dumb bombs, like the things you see in World War II, them dropping out of the planes. But they have a conversion kit strapped to them along with a GPS, so they will release them a ways away, and they will glide to the target. And they're extremely accurate, and an artillery shell might be, a kilogram or two of TNT, not very much explosive, whereas like a glide bomb will be 500, 1,000, 3,000 kilos of TNT, and it's extremely effective against fortifications, especially the fortified apartment buildings, which previously were eating up shells. So despite all of this, the front line continues to move relatively slowly. The Russians are gradually picking up the pace, but if you look at it, let's go back to last year. It doesn't really seem like it's moved that much. Now, granted, a lot of the territory Russia has taken is extremely important. It's fortified cities and stuff like that. But it's weird because despite Russia having all these advantages, they seem to be just creeping forward very slowly. So it's kind of simultaneously, it looks like a stalemate, but it's also, like, at this point, basically a completely one-sided curb stomp. So, like, how can these things be true at the same time? How can Russia have this massive manpower, firepower advantage, and it's barely making any progress over the land? How is the Ukrainian army able to keep enduring these massive losses? Well, when it comes to Schrodinger's war in Russia, it's a feature rather than a bug. After the initial offensive completely flopped, Russia wasn't able to get its Istanbul peace agreement and was badly outnumbered and overextended and had to withdraw from a lot of the territory it occupied. The war has largely been turned over to the Russian General Staff, who is very professional, very well educated, and from my understanding, compared to a lot of countries, fairly insulated from political pressure. And so since then, they've just been running this war as more of a military operation. It's interesting. Another just kind of one of the two simultaneous things at once. Sorry, is the Ukrainian war effort is almost entirely civilian run and based on political and media calculations, whereas the Russian war effort is almost entirely militarily run and everything is based on tactical and strategic concerns. For instance, Ukraine will not retreat from positions even when they're about to be surrounded. The Ukrainian high command and Zelensky would rather have thousands of soldiers get cut off and annihilated in a pocket rather than withdraw from a position. They tend to view this as any amount of sacrifice is worthwhile to hold the town for just a couple days more. Whereas the Russian high command will, even if they could hold a position, will sometimes retreat from it to high ground, to fortified position, to a more advantageous area, or just to set up a killing zone So when they withdraw and the Ukrainians stream in, all their artillery is pre-aimed at the area. And this happened very early on in the war when they abandoned a lot of the territory they conquered, including Kherson City, and were able to establish a defensible front line, which they largely held until their military had been built up to the point where they can start launching offensives. I think nothing more kind of exemplifies this than the whole Kursk offensive. So I had said that after the summer offensive of 2003, or the spring, summer, winter, fall offensive, wherein Ukraine basically used all of what I would describe as its offensive or strategic capacity to throw itself against the Russian lines, which we've been over many times. The Russians had like a 5-6 layer defense line. The Ukrainians, I don't think, even got to the first line. It depends on the location, though. But I had said they had permanently lost the strategic initiative after that, and I stand by that statement. Avdiivka, I said they lost their remaining reserves because they kept throwing people into the meat grinder of Avdiivka, even when it was surrounded, even when it was cut off, and they wouldn't let the men there surrender or withdraw. And they kept sending in reinforcements to try to break them out and hold the position a bit longer. And so since then, the Ukrainian army has not had reserves. Now, you might say, but Argent, they keep moving men around and reinforcing certain positions. Yes, but to my understanding, those are almost always pulled off of from other parts of the line where they're needed. It's not as if they have, like the Russians do, entire divisions who are just there to exploit breakthroughs or to react. Now, despite me saying that, some people were saying, well, Ukraine is back in action this year because they attacked Kursk. So Ukraine managed to get a bunch of stuff together and attacked a relatively undefended part of the Russian border in the Kursk region. Now they took, I don't know, let's see here. Let's take a look at what it was like at its height. I'm trying to remember when the Kursk offensive happened. Sorry, this thing is just taking a while to load. Yeah, I'm not sure if this was at the height or not, but as you can see, they took a pretty large-looking piece of land, at least based on the standards of the Russo-Ukraine war, which has seen relatively small movements. Now, the area is undefended and is rural, so to my understanding, there really wasn't much there for them to capture. Most of the villages were very small. I think Suzia or whatever, the largest town, was like a couple hundred or 1,000 people. The land is not strategically important. A lot of people thought that the goal might have been to take the Kursk nuclear power plant and hold that hostage, but the Russian army just basically retreated, let them run in, overextend their supply lines, and then the Ukrainian army was stuck having to hold territory away from their supply lines, away from Sumy and their other fortified areas. In which the Russians just, look at this, it's just enveloped, it's just a pocket there, are just able to they don't have any fortifications either, because they just took this territory. So the Russians are just able to, at will, fire bombs and missiles and artillery, and they don't have to engage unless they know that they're going to win and they have overwhelming local superiority. So the Ukrainian army they took a bit of territory, but as I said to one of my friends, it's kind of as if the Americans and Canadians were going to war, and like some Canadian brigade took a swath of territory in Montana and declared we're winning because we captured part of the U.S. It's not really relevant or important. It's a massive front line. Obviously, you can find some point of it wherein it's going to be less defended and you can attack it. And since then, they've just been pulling more and more troops off of the Donbass front in other parts to throw into here. And it's sunk to just this tiny pocket, and the Russians are just basically slowly moving in, but mostly letting them feed as many guys in as possible. I think the Russian strategy, and it's been their strategy for most of this war, is one of attrition. Basically, their goal is they understand that the Ukrainians cannot replenish their manpower, they can't replenish their armored vehicles, their ammunition. It's all finite. whereas the Russian economy is actually doing very well at the moment. The government's in like something like a 2% of GDP budget deficit, if even that. So the government is not going into massive amounts of debt. The economy's growing. They're not facing anything more than minor pinpricks from Ukrainian drones. They can do this all day, more or less. Their army is volunteer at this point in time. They haven't had to resort to more conscription. It isn't having a massive negative impact on the rest of Russian society. So they're free to just take as much time as they want. Putin seems to trust the general staff to just be running this thing. And so it is very much a case of nothing happens until it does. The Ukrainian army is just going to keep getting hollowed out more and more and more. They're going to keep taking huge casualties, losing what's left of their tanks, their air defense, their artillery. And at some point, it's going to crumble. At some point, I don't know, there's going to be mutinies, or there's going to be mass desertions, or surrenders, or there's going to be some sort of breakthrough, and it's just going to disintegrate. But until then, we're going to just keep up with this slow pace. So, like I said, we're either it seems like we're not really at the end of the war, but we're very close to the end of the war at the same time. Personally, and I don't like making predictions because nothing about this war makes a lot of sense, and my last one was extremely wrong. I had predicted that I thought Ukraine would start negotiations with Russia before the summer, but I was completely wrong about that, and we'll go into negotiations in a second. I could see it happening at any point now. I was trying to come up with some kind of fancy way of dealing with it. Like if it was going to be 10% the first month and then it increases by 10% almost every month as time goes on. Personally, I think there's probably about a 30% chance, if my understanding is correct, of the Ukrainian army collapsing by spring, maybe March or April. I would be absolutely shocked if they made it through the summer. I don't want to, once again, be too specific. I think there's a higher than 50% chance. I would be shocked if there's not like a 60-70% chance that there's some sort of widespread scale collapse prior to the end of the summer. I just don't really see how they're going to keep going at this point in time, especially given Trump is reluctant to provide them with any additional funding. So that brings us to Trump and the diplomatic situation. And once again, we are in a state of Schrodinger's war, wherein Russia is winning a decisive victory and looks like it can impose terms, but there's basically no progress with negotiations, and there can be no progress with negotiations. Let's just go over briefly what the demands of the two sides are, what their minimum demands are to even start negotiations. So Russia is adhering to something people call Istanbul Plus, which is basically what the basic agreement that they had in Istanbul at the start of this conflict, with a bunch of additional stuff tacked on to reflect changes on the battlefield and the political situation since then. So Putin's terms are as follows. The five regions, that is Crimea, Kherson, Zaporozhye, Luhansk, and Donetsk, will all be ceded to Russia, including the parts that are currently occupied by Ukraine, and they will be ceded de facto and de jure and become a legal part of the Russian Federation, and Ukraine will acknowledge that. That is number one. Number two, Ukraine will demilitarize and limit the size of its army to a specific size to be decided later. Ukraine will pledge to never possess nuclear weapons. And probably the single most important thing, and this is what the war was entirely about, in my opinion, it will enshrine in its constitution eternal neutrality and that it will never, never join NATO. There's some other things as well. They have this whole denazification meme. That means removal of all the laws that discriminate against Russian speakers, restoration of the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church that was banned, and the other churches that were banned under Zelensky, dismantling of various nationalist groups, and all that kind of stuff. And that is the base terms that Putin has. Those are the non-negotiable terms. They will not accept less than that. At the very least, maybe some of the stuff at the end is negotiable. Ukraine not joining NATO, I think, is by far the least negotiable. Maybe Crimea is also the least negotiable, but Russia will never accept Ukraine in NATO. That has been very decisively stated. Under no circumstances, they will, I think, use nuclear weapons before they accept Ukraine. Going into NATO, they view it as an existential threat to them, and something they will just not tolerate. Now, Ukraine's unnegotiable demands are as follows: Russia will withdraw from all of the occupied territory, including Crimea. Russia will pay war reparations. There will be war crime trials for the leaders of the Russian Federation, including Putin. And there's been some talk additionally about dividing Russia up, decolonizing Russia, and basically reducing it to some sort of servile state. Now that's extrapolation, but basically Russia has to cede all the territory they've occupied, including Crimea, pay reparations, and war crime trials is the minimum demands of Zelensky. As well as Ukraine's immediate accession into NATO and the EU. I forgot to add that in. And Zelensky has started saying also nuclear weapons in Ukraine is part of it as well. So, do these positions sound at all compatible? Is there any aspect of that that could be agreed upon between the two parties? Is there even any like negotiation that can happen between the two parties on these terms? And the answer is no. It really can't. The number one issue for Ukraine, more important, I think, even than its territorial integrity, is joining NATO. I would not be surprised even if they were willing to accept what they would consider the temporary occupation of whatever territory Russia holds in exchange for them being able to join NATO and the rest of their territory being covered by the NATO treaty guarantee. Russia, like I said, more so than just about anything other than maybe Crimea, will never negotiate on Ukrainian membership into NATO. It's just something they won't. And so you have the two positions which are just 100% mutually exclusive. There can be no sort of compromise between them. There can be no deal made. Now, Trump has kind of tried with that, and there's been suggestions of, oh, okay, well, maybe Ukraine can join NATO in like 20 years or 10 years or something like that. And Putin has just said, no, it's either Ukraine will never join NATO or this war continues until, I don't know, until something happens. So Trump is ready to start peace negotiations. Putin's ready to start peace negotiations, but neither side is really ready to start peace negotiations because their positions are impossible to reconcile. Russia will also not agree to a ceasefire or any kind of truce because they're winning, and any truce would just give Ukraine time to rebuild its army, train its soldiers, and construct fortifications. Basically, they would have absolutely nothing to gain through a truce. Their position gets better by the day. So Zelensky and his government have just decided that they're going to, as far as I can determine, just fight to the bitter end. To the last Ukrainian, there will just be no negotiations. There will be no surrender. They don't have elections anymore. They've arrested or shut down most of the political opposition. And it looks like they're just going to keep kidnapping people and throwing them into the meat grinder until the Ukrainian army inevitably collapses. So we're at the point in the war where there should be negotiations, but there's no negotiations. Now, Trump is going to start them, but like I said, I just think they're too far apart. I think unless Trump is willing to make compromises that I don't know if he politically can, it's not going to go anywhere. I think Trump would be okay with Ukraine not joining NATO and some of the other stuff. I don't know if he'll go as far as to accept like the legal transfer of the territories. America still has to save face on this one, and it's just, I don't know. The only way I can really see negotiations starting, I mean, they might start at a very superficial level. Productive negotiations is if there's some kind of regime change in Kiev. That is, Zelensky gets removed either by, I don't know, nationalists, ultra-nationalists, or a peace party, or a pro-Russia faction, or something, in their negotiation, their base conditions change to at least being willing to exclude themselves from NATO permanently. Unless that happens, though, I just don't think there's going to be any negotiations. And I think this thing is just going to keep going on until the Ukrainian army collapses. Now, what happens if the Ukrainian army does collapse and they cease to put up any kind of resistance, effective resistance, and Russia just surges forward? I, honest to God, don't think Russia really knows either. I don't think Putin knows how this thing is going to end. I don't think he really even has an end game at this point in time. I don't think Lavrov does. I don't know if the Russian general staff even does, because they've taken basically, with maybe the exception of Kharkov and Sumy and Odessa, they've taken most of the territory that was really important to them, that was like the core heartland of Novorossiya, where the population is the most friendly to them. Once again, I think Kharkov, to a certain extent, Sumy and Odessa are also in that category. But there's no real desire to go west of the Dnieper. West of the Dnieper is more ethnically Ukrainian and various minority groups. If you look at like an election map, the pro-Russia party did very well in the east and south of the country. The pro-EU party did very well in the western half of the country. They don't really have any friends over the Dnieper. They don't really have anybody who would either want to support them or would just passively support them, because at this point they don't really care so long as the fighting stops in one form or another. So to get to the Dnieper and then to cross it is just going to be a mess. Also, from my understanding, Ukraine cannot survive as a country if the entire east bank of the Dnieper is taken, because a lot of the major cities are on both sides of the Dnieper. So I don't even know if how that would that work, to be honest. And also, Russia may want to link up with Transnistria. That's also an aspect of this. But yeah. So what happens if it collides? Does Russia have to just occupy? Is there like some sort of ultra nationalist government in exile that sets itself up in Western Ukraine and keeps fighting? Does Russia have to go all the way to the borders of Poland and Hungary and Slovakia and Romania? I don't know, and I don't think they know either. Like, if you even listen to Putin, he's like, maybe we'll start holding some more referendums, we'll annex some more territory. They don't really seem to have any idea either. And that's kind of where I mean we're at with Schrodinger's war, where looks like it's going to win militarily at this point in time, but it really has no idea what it's going to do once it wins militarily, because there's no way to have a political or diplomatic solution to the whole thing. And so, like I said, we are in terms of Schrodinger's war. We have Russia on the verge of a military victory and a Ukrainian army collapse, but Russia with as far as I can determine, no idea what they're going to do, no idea what their end game is. You have negotiations that are basically metaphysically impossible to start because the two positions are mutually exclusive. I don't know. Europe is simultaneously 100% pro-Ukraine, and there's massive backlash against it. So I just don't really know where it goes. Like I said, I think the Ukrainian army will probably collapse in some form or another by the summer. But once again, I don't know what that means. Does that mean it just collapses? Does that mean Russia takes Kharkov and Sumy, and then it stops? Does it just take the remainder of the the five regions? Does it go to the Dnieper? I really don't know. And that is the question. I don't think Putin knows either. And you have hawks who want to go to the Dnieper and want to take over all of Ukraine. You have people who are more kind of conservative about it. The thing is, though, a resolve in Russia has massively increased over time. With the higher the casualties, also just a lot of the various shenanigans the West has pulled. And the Russian population seems fairly united and fairly determined to see this thing through to the end. So there doesn't seem to be any real possibility of a coup toppling Putin or there being any kind of mass protests against him. His position seems more secure than ever. The Russian economy is doing well. The war, they have not had to go into a war economy. They haven't had to ask the average Russian to make large sacrifices into their standard of living. And so it's gonna continue. I guess I'm trying to think of like a relevant historical example. Maybe if like during the Vietnam War, what if America had completely destroyed the Viet Cong and totally mauled the North Vietnamese military to the point where it was unable to do anything? I mean, what would they do at that point? Did they invade North Vietnam? I don't even know. They come to some sort of they. We're going to say in this scenario that neither side is willing to negotiate. So, like, what does the U.S. even do there? And that's where we're at the moment. I don't know what Russia's going to do. I don't know what Trump's going to do. It's just a mess. But once again, something could change at any given point. You could have you could have a regime change in Kiev. You could have Trump surprising us with whatever he offers. We could have the Russians putting their backs into it and getting a total breakthrough and achieving a military victory. They could set up a puppet government in Kiev that has to join the Union state with Belarus or the Eurasian Union or something. I don't really know, but that's where things stand as we head into 2025. There's waning support for Ukraine in Europe and North America. They don't have the money. A lot of NATO countries have become effectively demilitarized at this point in time, as they've given basically all of their military equipment and ammunition to Ukraine. And Europe is facing a massive economic crisis because they cut off all the cheap Russian gas, and it's been a relatively cold winter there. And then they've also done stupid stuff like closing nuclear power plants. Also, I think there's not been that much wind this year. So the whole thing is just a mess. The European economies are in recession and declining rapidly. They can't produce enough weapons. When this war ends, Europe is going to be in huge amounts of debt. Their economies are going to be in recession and they're going to be demilitarized. Now, does this mean that Russia is going to attack? Obviously not. That would lead to nuclear war, and I don't think Putin is. Putin is a very cautious man, and I don't think he's going to risk that. I know he saber rattles about it, but I still kind of doubt that they would ever knowingly try to make that happen, but that's just me. So anyways, anybody, that is my thoughts on the Russo-Ukraine war, where we're at overall, what happened in 2024, and what will happen in 2025. Let's hope one way or another this war comes to a conclusion, because the massive human cost of a conflict that cannot be won and will not be negotiated is just depressing. And every day, hundreds of brave men die for a lost cause. So God bless everybody. Have a great day, and I'll talk to you all later.